Geoffrey McNicoll, a native of Australia, earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Melbourne in 1964 and then worked for a few years in Indonesia's Central Bureau of Statistics. He completed a PhD in demography in 1972 at the University of California at Berkeley a few months before I began my graduate study there. After graduate school, he worked at the East-West Population Institute and the University of Hawaii in Honolulu before shifting to New York City, where he has remained as a senior researcher at the Population Council for the rest of his career. As a frequent contributor and now co-editor of the leading demographic research journal, Population and Development Review, McNicoll has played a leading role in scholarly work on international population research and policy. This article from 1998 is important because McNicoll not only looks back at some basic ideas of Malthus, but also brings those ideas into the present and relates them to our contemporary world and its demographic challenges. We will take a closer look at his claim that the worries Malthus had about the power of population to cause mischief in human life have all been attended to and no longer need to concern us today. One of the first issues that Geoffrey McNicoll tackles in this article is the common misperception that Malthus was against population growth. When people today proclaim that the world has too many people, such anti-population activists often are described as Malthusian or Neo-Malthusians. McNicoll has no patience with this mistaken label. He knows that Malthus, just like Giovanni Botero or Benjamin Franklin before him, was actually a populationist who believed that population growth was part of God's plan. Malthus thought that a large population was a sign of an effective society. McNicoll gives us examples from the writing of Malthus to illustrate this populationist attitude, but we have seen similar examples for ourselves in our own reading of the gloomy parson. After all, Malthus looked at the low population density of native populations in the Americas and other parts of the world encountered by European explorers, and immediately judged such societies to be inferior to European ones simply on the basis of their limited populations. Malthus also compared different European colonies in the New World and rank-ordered them in terms of success, level of civilization, and moral virtue based on evidence that English colonies were larger and growing faster than the inferior colonies of the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, or the Dutch. And in cases where societies were actually losing population, Malthus never hesitated to take this as obvious evidence that such places were not only hopelessly mismanaged, but probably lacking in morality and civilization. There can be no question that Malthus, too, is a populationist who believes that a growing population is a sign that any society has at least got part of the game right. So why have so many people gotten Malthus wrong? Why has the label of Malthusian gotten attached so often to people who look at population growth as dangerous and evil, and who want to turn back the clock to earlier times when there were fewer people in the world? Malthus must give us some excuse to misunderstand him in this way. Most likely this misunderstanding springs from one of the most famous statements of Malthus, that, quote, population, when unchecked, always presses upon the means of subsistence, unquote, and that this power of population means that the world will always have to deal with misery and vice as a result. But this comparison of the rates of growth of population and of resources, or in Malthus's language, food, has two parts, not just the population part. For Malthus, the problem comes not because population is increasing, but because food and other resources can't keep up. His disapproval is reserved for the problems that prevent resources from keeping up with population, and these things for him always can be resolved into mistakes, imperfections, and problems in the way we have organized our societies. This is exactly the same as Botero's judgment that the limitations and problems come from a lack of the virtue nutritive, not from the existence of the virtue generative. Malthus does admit that, unfortunately, the world is not a perfect place, and that this pressure of population on resources will continue to be a problem. The real issue for him, the practical issue of everyday life, then boils down to the question of what kind of checks we want to have, keeping the population in balance with the level of resources we can manage to produce. Obviously, we should prefer to rely on preventive checks rather than positive checks, like famine, pestilence, and war that wipe out people already in existence. The extent of such preventive checks in any society are one reliable sign for Malthus of how truly civilized that society actually is. But there are a range of possible preventive checks that we can use, and here McNicoll faithfully reminds us that Malthus did start out as a country parson, whose stock in trade was morality. According to the morality preached by the Church of England around the year 1800, there was only one kind of preventive check to population that was acceptable from a religious or ethical moral standpoint. Malthus called this option moral restraint, by which he simply meant delaying marriage until a couple was sure that they had sufficient resources to support all the children that they might have. This early Malthus, as he is sometimes called, who wrote the first essay on population in 1798, was fresh out of training for the ministry and thought mainly in terms of sin and righteousness, good and evil, and what God intended for his creation. It is impossible to read that first essay of 1798, especially the final chapter, without feeling like you are sitting in his church on a Sunday morning listening to a sermon. Moral restraint, that is to say delayed marriage, is the only preventive check that is consistent with virtue and happiness. Everything else leads to sin and unhappiness one way or another. But of course, Malthus himself changed over the next 3 decades of his life. In particular, his outlook on the whole issue of population evolved after he became a professor of political economy instead of a minister. He gradually shifted from the mostly moralistic tone of the 1798 essay until by the time he got to his massive 2-volume edition of 1826, his writing was full of the clockwork of economic thinking. He gradually came to see human behavior as not only subject to religious judgments about morality, but as influenced, indeed perhaps even determined, by larger forces in the world of economic and political interactions and institutions. It would not be far short of the mark to say that by the end of his life, Malthus had just about caught up completely to the outlook of Giovanni Botero, whose recipe for social organization to guarantee a healthy virtue nutritive involved a government that combined peace with justice. Malthus used almost exactly the same language to explain how a country could best encourage people to practice moral restraint and keep population in balance with resources, with one important new addition. Malthus not only emphasized the importance of liberty and justice for people, but also the vital importance of protecting the right to private property. McNicoll includes a long quote from Malthus about governments that fail to protect all 3 of these pillars of virtue. Malthus condemned the Ottoman Empire as a hopeless failure in all 3 respects. In the Ottoman Empire, the government's, quote, tyranny, its feebleness, its bad laws and worst administration of them, together with the consequent insecurity of property, throws such obstacles in the way of agriculture that the means of subsistence are necessarily decreasing yearly, and with them, of course, the number of people, unquote. This is a perfect example showing that Malthus was indeed a populationist and that he had the same recipe as other populationists for how a society should keep its population growing successfully. Just as many people use the term Malthusian to describe attitudes that population growth is a bad thing, when Malthus clearly believed just the opposite, some details of what kind of preventive checks we should use to avoid positive checks also have gotten away from what Malthus actually said. Today, the advocates of family planning often are referred to as Malthusians. They want to provide couples with contraceptives like condoms, birth control pills, intrauterine devices, and other technology so that people can have sex as much as they want without producing a constant flood of babies. Particularly in developing countries where birth rates are still high, family planners also often advocate government programs to encourage people to adopt these technologies. International foundations provide support to family planners to campaign for such programs and to actually distribute these technologies through networks of family planning clinics. McNicoll makes it perfectly clear that here again we have lost touch with the actual ideas of Malthus. Certainly as a minister of the Church of England when he wrote his 1798 essay, Malthus rejected artificial contraception as unnatural and against the will of God. It was a form of vice, something that he described as used mainly by prostitutes and certainly not suitable for respectable married women. Only delayed marriage could be counted as moral restraint. Other kinds of preventive checks, including not only artificial contraceptives, but also homosexuality, which Malthus referred to as unnatural passions, and other things that would reduce the birth rate, had to be written off as various categories of vice. McNicoll devotes one major part of his article to evaluating how Malthus treated the problem of distribution, that is, how to organize the virtue-nutritive aspect of society and share out food and other resources. Here again, many writers have judged Malthus to be flint-hearted and cold, just as Charles Dickens did when he put Malthus's ideas into the mouth of his Ebenezer Scrooge character. McNicoll quotes a famous example of this side of Malthus, a passage that does not appear in the original 1798 essay, but that he added to the 1803 edition, and then later dropped out again after it generated a storm of criticism. Quote, "A man who is born into a world already possessed has no claims of right to the smallest portion of food, and in fact has no business to be where he is." Unquote. The key point that McNicoll tries to make here is not that Malthus wanted people to starve to death, but that it was both unrealistic and ethically questionable to talk about this issue in terms of people's rights. Most of us are well aware that the concept of a natural or absolute human right is a two-faced coin. If we look at the human rights enshrined in the Constitution of the United States, the rights of life, liberty, freedom of religion, and the right to assemble, and so on, the key thing about every such right is that on the other side of that coin is a responsibility. If you respect my right to be alive, you have a duty not to kill me. If I have a freedom to be a Baptist or a Muslim, you have a duty not to burn down my place of worship or beat me up for my religious beliefs. One person's right defines how other people may and may not behave towards him or her. For Malthus, this key fact about natural rights makes no sense when we begin to talk about an absolute natural right of people to food or other forms of support. If I have a right to food, who has the duty to give it to me? The farmer, even if I can't pay for it? What about his right to control the food he has grown? Who has the duty to move the eggs from someone's chicken house into my refrigerator? This is the objection that Malthus is raising in the quote that McNicoll gives us. He is objecting to the idea that we should think of the whole problem in terms of absolute natural rights that we can't actually fulfill. Rights without duties and responsibility to meet them are meaningless ideas that cheapen the whole concept of a natural right, and sloppy thinking into the bargain. McNicoll brings this idea home to us by translating the problem into one that we can recognize more clearly. We might argue that within the United States no one should go hungry, and that we should organize some kind of virtue nutritive so that everybody has access to healthy food. The wealth and prosperity of American society actually make this a plausible idea. But McNicoll, like Malthus, suggests that we should describe this as a desirable thing to do without resorting to the language of natural rights. He compares this plausible idea to another kind of natural right that is much less popular or self-evident to most Americans. Do international refugees, McNicoll asks, have natural rights to asylum in the United States? Should we open our national gates and accept any and all refugees who show up based on their absolute natural right to safety and security? Should we recognize the rights of all the refugees in the world to jobs, to housing, to government support, to U.S. citizenship? Suggesting that these are natural human rights that should be extended to any refugee from anywhere in the world would be fiercely unpopular for most Americans, including most of those who work to guarantee food and other benefits to all Americans, as well as to many of the Americans who are benefiting from social programs such as free school lunches, government-subsidized housing, and other programs that are often justified in terms of people's basic rights.
Malthus, says McNicoll, simply argued that you should not describe every kind of program or benefit that might seem like a good idea as something that satisfied some absolute natural right of its beneficiaries. So here we are in a world where many of Malthus's ideas have been misunderstood or misinterpreted, but in which most of them still seem to deal with issues that remain important and often controversial. But there's one aspect of McNicoll's picture of Malthus that doesn't seem to ring quite true. Remember that early in his article, McNicoll remarked that, quote, Malthus's worries have of course been attended to, though belatedly, and by vice rather than prudence, unquote. Of course, when he says vice, he is talking about the modern American reliance on contraceptives to ensure that there's plenty of sex, but that the birth rate stays low and doesn't threaten to overwhelm the food supply. Although Malthus would have disapproved of this contraceptive society as riddled with vice, particularly if he watched a few contemporary American movies or television shows, McNicoll seems to conclude that the power of population itself is no longer much of a problem. In fact, some countries, particularly in Europe, are worrying that they're not producing enough babies to keep their populations going. But have Malthus's worries really been attended to? In the final part of this lecture, we will examine some facts and figures about growth rates from countries around the world to see whether the gap between the birth rate and the death rate really has been brought under control. We will see just how irrelevant the views of Malthus have become in our own time. To understand why McNicoll might say that today we have pretty much resolved Malthus's concerns about population pressing on the means of subsistence, we need to keep in mind that he's mainly looking at the situation in modern, urban industrial societies like the United States, Japan, Sweden, England, Germany, and other countries that have completed all the stages of the demographic transition from high birth and death rates to low birth and death rates. These countries may have endured a transition period when death rates fell before birth rates began to decline, a period when their populations grew very rapidly due to the gap between birth and death rates. Eventually, though, the birth rates also dropped. Population growth stabilized at a slow pace that was no problem for these growing economies to handle. That is what he means when he says that we have resolved the concerns of Malthus. Is this a valid perspective on the world as we know it today? Have Malthus's concerns really been attended to, as McNicoll suggests? Let us look at some of the countries around the world, comparing their present-day birth and death rates and the rates of population growth that these produce. First, we must recognize that McNicoll actually understates the situation in some countries today. For example, in countries under communist control in the second half of the 20th century, such as Hungary, the Ukraine, Russia, and most of the other countries in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, crude birth rates, shown here in green as births per thousand population, are actually below crude death rates, shown here in red as deaths per thousand population. These countries are actually losing people every year, experiencing more deaths than births. No concerns about runaway population growth here, but what would Malthus say? Based on what we already know about him, we can guess that he would say these are obvious examples of bad government. Botero would have called it a lack of virtue nutritive. Despite their shrinking populations, they still might find population pressing on the means of subsistence if the economies in these countries are also collapsing. But at least there are no threat here of excessive population growth. Only about 1 out of every 7 people in these countries is under the age of 15, so they should have no problem supporting this low share of children in their populations. In this next set of examples, we see countries where crude birth and death rates are exactly in balance. Both birth and death rates in the cases of Austria, Italy, and Japan are even lower than in the countries that were losing population, but these countries have brought down their death rates just as far, so they're cruising along with the same population year after year. Again, there's no danger here of runaway population growth, and again, with only 1 dependent child out of every 7 people in the population, there should be no problem about providing for each new generation. In the third group of 4 countries, including the United States as well as Spain, Sweden, and China, we find what Malthus might have looked at as the ideal situation. These are countries where the birth rate is just slightly higher than the death rate, so that these countries are growing a little bit, as every good populationist would like to see, but not so fast as to overwhelm the virtue nutritive and threaten these societies with positive checks. With their slightly higher birth rates, these countries also have slightly higher shares of dependent children in their populations, but still nothing to worry about. We could still agree with McNicoll that the concerns of Malthus have been attended to. This judgment may be a little more doubtful when we move on to countries like Venezuela, Israel, or India, where the gap between the birth rate and the death rate is between 15 to 20 per thousand population, that is, growth of just under 2% per year. In these countries with birth rates over 20 per thousand, nearly a third of the population consists of dependent children, and we might start getting a little nervous about taking care of all of them. Still, the death rates are very low, so maybe these countries also have things pretty much under control. But the story continues, this time with countries like Guatemala, Sudan, or Pakistan that have crude birth rates of more than 30 per thousand. In these cases, the populations are growing by more than 2% every year. 4 of every 10 people in these countries are children who depend on the other 6 out of 10. If Malthus were with us and looking at these figures, he would be getting nervous, particularly when he noticed that Sudan's death rate has inched up again compared to some of the low death rates in other countries. Is this evidence of positive checks in action? Finally, we arrive at the extreme growth champions of the contemporary world. In Africa and parts of the Middle East, represented here by Nigeria, Angola, and Afghanistan, birth rates are above 40 births for every 1,000 people, 4 times higher than in the low birth rate countries. Death rates are also higher than in any of the other countries examined so far. Populations are growing at between 2 and 3% every year. Nearly half of all the people in these countries are young children who depend on the other half for food and care. Clearly, population is growing at rates close to what Malthus described as the maximum possible for human society. Equally clearly, positive checks are very much in evidence. This does not look like a world in which the concerns of Malthus have all been taken care of. If we go beyond a few examples and look at the entire populations of different world regions, we can see that in some places like Europe, North America, and countries in East Asia like China and Japan, Malthus would be able to relax. Birth rates are almost as low as death rates, or even lower, and populations are growing at less than 1% per year. But at the other end of the scale, in South Asia, West Asia, also called the Middle East, and Africa, birth rates are still extremely high and populations are growing at between 2 and 3% per year, near what Malthus regarded as the human maximum. Not only that, but these regions with the highest birth rates also have the highest death rates, indicating that they must be feeling some of the pressures of population on resources and experiencing some positive as well as preventive checks, without which their growth rates would be even higher. To confirm the judgment that the world as a whole is not yet done with the concerns of Malthus, this second chart shows the share of the world's present population found in each of the regions presented in the first chart. Regions appear in the same order as in the first chart, from the slowest growing on the left side to the fastest growing on the right side. It is true that a large share of the world's population live in regions that now have quite slow or even no population growth. But the regions on the right side of the graph, especially South Asia and Africa, also contain tremendous populations, and the fact that they are growing rapidly means that these bars for total population on the right side are growing taller all the time, while the bars on the left side, including Europe and North America, as well as China, are increasing much more slowly, if at all. So the population of the world as a whole is actually shifting toward the regions where we have not yet solved the concerns of Malthus. Malthus thought that at our fastest, human populations might double every 25 years if unchecked. The growth rates observed in these fast-growing regions would double the population of Africa every 33 years, of Southeast Asia every 39 years, and of South Asia every 43 years. That is, 2 or 3 doublings within the lifetime of a modern citizen of the world such as yourself. Imagine India with 4 or 5 billion people instead of 1 billion people before the end of your own lifetime, and you begin to see the problem. Why isn't McNicoll worried about these parts of the world? In his article, he suggests that all parts of the world are going through the same demographic transition sequence. First, falling death rates, then a period of rapid population growth while birth rates are still high, then falling birth rates, and finally a post-transition equilibrium with both birth and death rates at low levels. The figures just shown catch some regions before they go through that third stage of falling birth rates, so their rates of growth look quite alarming. If they do go through the rest of the transition, McNicoll may be right, and the concerns of Malthus may be resolved. If they do not, that's a very different world indeed. So the crucial question is, how and when do countries shift into that third stage of falling birth rates? This question will come up again and again with other readings and lectures.